Hello everybody and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today we have something different to our usual webinars, as we have a panel discussion. It centres around the recent thinkstep-anz SDG report, and we have a wide array of guest speakers who all provide their insights regarding them and how they relate to their respective organisations. Here's a sneak preview.
The need for societies to get their act together to solve urgent and complex problems has never been greater.
I think it's important to note that reporting on the SDGs is actually really challenging. So whilst it's accepted that the scale and the pace of change needed to meet the SDGs is not large enough nor fast enough.
And so it's really encouraging to see that a lot of companies do see this as core business. They see the SDGs as a really useful framework for driving change within their own companies.
It can seem a little daunting when you look at the full set of indicators and targets, but don't let it put you off because there are some real gems in there. The other thing that I wanted to call out is around the power of the SDGs in relation to your supply chain.
BCSD, or the World Business Commission for Sustainable Development, estimated that the SDGs drive about US 12 trillion worth of opportunities across a range of sectors.
We can see in both countries that SDG 13, climate action, is the most popular, followed by SDG 8, decent work and economic growth.
I think we've made the SDGs incredibly real for our business. Our teams have strategic plans where they talk about the initiatives they have within those SDGs. And the effort we give to them is pretty significant through application of capital and through the strategies that we adopt. It's been a really comfortable, happy fit.
The number one that we would pick would be SDG 12, which is responsible production and consumption. We interpret that as a circular economy. The other fundamental SDG, which we would call out, is SDG 15.
Because of the variety of organisations, the panellists discussing how they implemented the SDGs, the challenges involved, and further thoughts regarding them really makes this installment an insightful viewing. With that, let's get started.
Welcome everyone to our SDG panel discussion this afternoon. I'm really excited to have such a distinguished panel here to discuss some of the findings of our SDG status report that we've just launched last week. The key conversation really is around the role of businesses in achieving the SDGs, and that is what we looked at in our report. We have Kylie Porter from the Global Compact Network Australia, Mike Burrell from Sustainable Business Council in New Zealand. We have Mark Trow here, CEO of Freightways, Lachlan Figgins, Sustainability Director for Asia Pacific Brambles, and Matt Brennan, Sustainability Strategy for Transurban. And we have Rod Oram, a business journalist, to facilitate the discussion this afternoon. I'm really excited to hear from all of you what your thoughts are on how your businesses and your members can contribute. But before we get to that, I'd like to introduce my colleague Tim, who was the main researcher of our report, and he will introduce some of the findings to you. Over to you, Tim.
Tēnā koutou, nau mai haere mai to all of our panellists, and thanks so much for being able to join us today. My name is Tim Worth, and I manage the research and writing of the SDG status report. So I'd like to quickly introduce how we did the report and share a few of our key findings. Our survey focused entirely on annual reports and sustainability reports published by the ASX and NZX top 50 companies. And in some cases, those included what companies call their ESG or CSR reports, but we didn't in the end include sustainability information from web pages, so it was exclusively for published reports. Now, we refreshed our survey several times between July 2019 and January 2021, and this was to make sure that we captured all of the companies that were represented in the top 50 over that survey period, and to also capture reports published across the whole survey period as they came up. So we used a number of criteria to assess how these companies are performing on SDG reporting, and I'd like to share a few of the results with you now. So first, there are a few quick takeaways from our research that are interesting to state before going into detail on the findings. Through our research, we've noticed that Australian companies are increasingly aligning with the same SDGs, which is perhaps demonstrating that these companies are looking to make progress on some of the same key issues. And it can also mean that stakeholders are asking for action in certain key sustainability areas at the moment. For New Zealand companies reporting on the SDGs, the overall number of SDGs being selected has risen throughout the reporting period. So this might show a maturing approach to reporting in New Zealand. And overall, it's quite encouraging. We can obviously say that Australian companies are further along in the SDG reporting, as the graph shows. However, again, New Zealand companies are gradually catching up. Of course, what is most important in this graph is how frequently each SDG is being selected by the ASX and NZX top 50 companies. So we can see in both countries that SDG 13, climate action, is the most popular, followed by SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and SDG 5, gender equality. So these SDGs could be considered the most popular, a little bit more on that soon. It's important to point out which SDGs have ranked quite low as well, I think. And SDGs related to poverty and hunger, SDGs 1 and 2, and water quality and life below water, which are SDGs 6 and 14 respectively, are the least commonly selected by the companies that we surveyed. So one interpretation for this could be that the survey companies feel these are not SDGs that their businesses can strongly influence and therefore have prioritized other goals. To take a closer look at the three most popular SDGs, it's interesting that they cover all the bases that the SDGs have been designed for. So looking at the most common combinations here, we actually have those top three. They're appearing 40 times and they're representing environmental, economic, and social issues. So this shows some really holistic thinking on the part of the surveyed companies and their sustainability strategies. Once we factor in SDG 12, which is responsible consumption production, and SDG 10, reduced inequalities, we get a sense that these companies are considering the full breadth of impacts in their strategies. Before I hand over to our panel, I wanted to take the opportunity to point out this graphic relating to the level of SDG reporting. So for companies who are reporting on the SDGs, there's still quite high variability in how they're using the SDGs. A good number of companies are assigning KPIs to the SDGs with varying degrees of specific detail on what those KPIs mean and how they're measured. Companies with KPIs relating to generic UN targets are definitely further along in progressing the SDGs. However, as you can see from the little yellow blocks there, these companies represent only a small number of the surveyed group. For us, the optimal level of reporting is selecting SDGs with KPIs and quantitative company-specific targets. So companies taking this approach are shown in green, and in fact, we have a few of those companies represented in our panel today. For us, the companies achieving this are leading the way on SDG reporting. This level of detail demonstrates that companies are thinking really hard about which SDGs relate to their business and putting forward detailed strategies to meet specific targets. In effect, they're making the SDGs their own.
And now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Rod. Rod Oram is an experienced business journalist with a very keen interest in the SDGs. And because he's a business journalist, he'll be really able to drill in and find out what companies can do to achieve those SDGs. Rod, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Barbara and Tim. And kia ora tātou, welcome to you all here in Aotearoa, New Zealand and in Australia and perhaps elsewhere, thanks to the great boon of Zoom to us. So thank you for joining us this afternoon for this SDG discussion. The need for societies to get their act together to solve urgent and complex problems has never been greater. And indeed, whether that be the climate crisis or the massive challenges of COVID-19 or rapidly degenerating and degrading ecosystems or rapidly rising inequalities and social tensions, to name but a few. And those pressures are only increasing. But there is perhaps also a sense that at this time of heightened opportunities for us to fast forward our progress. So here, for example, is a quote from the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at Oxford University last May, when it started its analysis on how companies and countries were responding to the COVID pandemic. It said, COVID-19 has already triggered major shifts in individual behaviours, social practices, beliefs, the role of the government in the economy, and relationship between nations and international institutions. These shifts have occurred on remarkably rapid timescales. Now, indeed, on these great issues, all members of society have vital roles to play, but perhaps business is particularly important for the way business gathers together various capitals, financial, of course, human, natural, and social, to name just four of the most important ones, and then puts them to work. And for us all to progress, we need to be able to set goals and measure our progress, which is why I've long been a fan of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because they identify 17 utterly crucial measures for progress and sets goals for them. But fascinatingly, they are useful across the scale of human endeavor, right from a global context to nations, to cities, to communities, to companies and other organizations, and even down to those very keen people, those individuals who choose some of the SDGs and make personal commitments around them. So the SDGs are so important to help us understand and work on those great challenges, which is why it's a great pleasure to have this discussion this afternoon to pick up on some of the themes from the ThinkStep report. We've got 5 wonderful panelists for you this afternoon, and I'm going to turn first to our first panelist, Kylie Porter, who's CEO of the UN Global Compact Network Australia. Kylie is a sustainability expert and business leader holding particular expertise in delivering and implementing responsible business and corporate responsibility strategies. So Kylie, over to you, and we're very keen, please, to hear from you about what your sense is from your work on the Global Compact Network as to how the SDG work is progressing.
Great. Thanks, Rod, and thanks for the introduction. For those who aren't aware of the UN Global Compact, I thought I might give it a very quick overview, and then I'll answer your question, Rod. But first of all, from an Australian perspective, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet upon today. We're all the Australians on the call are from different parts of Australia, so we're from different parts of First Nations country. So I pay my respect to all those First Nations peoples, past, future, and emerging. So the UN Global Compact was launched in 2000 by the then Secretary General Kofi Annan. It really was a call to business to align their strategies and operations with 10 principles around human rights, labour, environment, and anti-corruption, and to take steps that advance societal goals. Now, when the SDGs came about and were agreed by all 193 member states in 2015, the UN Secretary General gave the UN Global Compact effectively the mandate to work with business to assist them in implementing the SDGs. Today, the UN Global Compact is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We're a leadership platform for development, implementation, discourse, innovation, in responsible and sustainable corporate policies and practices. In Australia, the Global Compact Network Australia, or the GCNA, plays a really crucial role in working with business to deliver the ambition needed to address sustainable development through initiatives like the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So both Lachlan and Matt work for companies that are participants of the UN Global Compact and members of the GCNA here. From our point of view, and Rod, you already touched on it, the great thing about the 17 goals is that it makes it easy for businesses to implement them because of the indicators and targets that sit underneath them. And they also provide a really vital framework for investors to assess how they're integrating inclusive economic growth into business strategies and operations. I think, for us, what we see is that the leaders in this space, they're the smart entities. They're the ones that have a principle-based approach to business that goes far beyond minimum standards of compliance. And that then enables them to have trust in their business, the employees trust the business, which obviously strengthens their shareholder value if we want to go down the shareholder primacy route. Having said that, I think it's important to note that reporting on the SDGs is actually really challenging. So whilst it's accepted that the scale and the pace of change needed to meet the SDGs is not large enough nor fast enough, We know that clear and accurate reporting from businesses and also from government is a challenge because there isn't a clear and consistent framework. Some organisations use GRI. For some organisations, it's too complex to implement GRI. And so some implement it their own way. And then you've got other reporting requirements like the Global Compact's communication on progress, which again doesn't completely distill all of the areas that you need to report on. What was really interesting about ThinkStep's report is that the most reported on SDGs actually align very closely to what the UN Global Compact calls their lead and shape SDGs. So these are SDG 5 on gender equality, SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, SDG 13 on climate action. The other two that are included in our 5 SDG focus areas are SDG 16 on peace, justice and strong institutions and SDG 17 on partnerships for the goals. So I think it's really clear with those first 3 as to why there is such a heavy focus on them. You know, climate action is a very big thing, particularly in the lead up to COP26 and the number of companies realising the value of decarbonisation. Gender equality, clearly a big issue. And for those in Australia, they would know that this has been a perpetuating issue in terms of how women are treated within the workplace, particularly after the Respect at Work report was released last year by the Australian Human Rights Commission. And then decent work and economic growth, one of the key indicators in there is modern slavery. And so in Australia, we have a Modern Slavery Act, and New Zealand's obviously considering that at the moment as well. So the last 2 SDGs, 16 and 17, these are often forgotten, particularly SDG 16. And I think from a business perspective, it's important to realise that anything that falls into your anti-bribery and corruption mechanisms actually directly contributes to SDG 16. So you'll probably find that there are a lot of companies already doing things in that space, but just not seeing the interlinkages between that and the SDGs. Interestingly, the UN Global Compact's progress report had similar results to ThinkStep. So it revealed that 84% of participating companies report on taking action in support of the SDGs. Again, SDG 8, Goal 3, which is good health and wellbeing, SDG 12 on responsible consumption and production that I'm sure Lachlan will touch on, and SDG 13 on climate action were the most talked about goals. And that 61% of those companies actually develop products and services towards those. However, only 46% of companies are really embedding the SDGs into their core business, and 37% are designing models that contribute to the SDGs. What this suggests is that while there are companies across all sectors that are raising awareness and positively contributing to the SDGs, so that includes Transurban, it includes Brambles, it includes other large companies like Intrepid Travel, Australia Post, Wesfarmers, etc. There is also heaps of room for improvement. More companies need to report transparently on things like their transition plans for decarbonisation. More companies need to set science-based targets or clear mechanisms around climate action. They need to spend more time managing their supply chains and understanding worker voice to minimise the risks of modern slavery. But they also need to be willing to contribute to the discussion about which goals they're negatively contributing on. So we know that being open and transparent about we're positively implementing or having an impact on climate action, but potentially we're negatively impacting on life underwater is something that I would like to see companies progress on over the coming years.
You've raised a number of fabulously interesting points that we'll come back to. And it's wonderful to have your overall perspective there because of the breadth of your work. Now, in a sense, we're going to turn now to Mike Burrell at the Sustainable Business Council here in New Zealand, because he's able to give an overview, as you have, but from his experience working with SBC members. And for those of you who are not familiar with our structure here in New Zealand, a crucial part of the Sustainable Business Council is its allied organisation, the Climate Leaders Coalition, of companies that are making substantial climate commitments and acting on them. So Mike joined SBC in January 2020, and his previous roles have included in government. His previous job before coming to the SPC was New Zealand's High Commissioner in South Africa, for example, as a diplomat. But he's also been involved in government in areas such as sustainable economic development in the Ministry for Foreign Investment, Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the founding CEO of Aquaculture New Zealand as an industry organisation here. So welcome, Mike, and over to you.
First of all, a big thank you to the ThinkStep team for what I think is an excellent report. Succinct, tells a very clear story, and some indications that even in these very challenging times, and as we've seen with the news over the last week in India, the challenging times continue, we've seen more and more commitment to the SDGs. And I suppose I want to start with that context because I think that's really important. I think it's very easy to forget just how tough it is out there for companies at the moment, globally and of course in our region. And so we're very aware that asking companies to continue to report on more and more things at a time when frankly many are in survival mode is a big ask. And so it's really encouraging to see that a lot of companies do see this as core business. They see the SDGs as a really useful framework for driving change within their own companies, for thinking about how they put together their strategies. And when we speak to our members, and as Rod said, we cover two memberships. There's the SBC, which has got 115 members, and another organisation called the Climate Leaders Coalition. When we look out across that combined group of 150, and we ask them, why is it that you've stayed with us during these really challenging times? They've said that things like the SDG framework, things like sustainable business in general, are really good frameworks to cling to during difficult times, because they give you a way of thinking about how you organise your business, how you prioritise. And so it's encouraging to see that coming through in what the report says. I'm not surprised that those SDGs that have been mentioned, SDG 8, 3 and 13, come to the top. It would be very unusual in one of the greatest recessions in the last century if companies weren't focused on economic growth. In fact, they wouldn't be doing their jobs. In fact, they wouldn't be surviving if they weren't. And so I suppose one of my key takeaways from this is it's good to see prioritisation occurring. And as we remember, when the SDGs were first put together back in the mid-2010s, the idea is that you wouldn't go and try and do all 17 of them. You would prioritise for your own business, your own organisation, a handful of SDGs that were relevant to you, and you would pursue those. And of course, SDG 17 partnerships would be a key component. And I think that's a really important thing for non-business organisations to reflect on, which is in Australia and particularly in New Zealand, many of our businesses are not large. In fact, if you go to the American standard definitions around large business, we only have 6. All of the others by international definitions are medium businesses. Even our big businesses are medium businesses. Many of what we describe as small businesses are in fact micro businesses. And so that means that when they are reporting on SDGs, this is a big task. They don't generally have people that they can delegate to. They have to do it themselves. So the very fact that they are reporting on them and that they're using them as frameworks, I think is really encouraging. The other challenge in a New Zealand context, and we've picked this up recently when we were looking at why it was that New Zealand wasn't doing more in the SDG space, is the fact that we have a wellbeing budget framework. And the wellbeing budget is fantastic. It's world leading. We really applaud it. It's great to get behind it. But what it has done is created some confusion, particularly for businesses. Should they be using the wellbeing budget, the government's framework, as the framework for thinking about sustainability and things in the space, or should they be using the international framework of SDGs? Now, what we say, of course, is, well, you can use both, and in fact, the two are consistent, but that does create some confusion, and we think there's probably some room for some education out there in the business community to explain how each of them work. Just 2 last points, Rod, from me. One is to, I suppose, pull out the piece around the fact that we are in the middle of a crisis, and this crisis is, I think, deeper and longer lasting than perhaps we would have expected. And we need to think about how we support businesses, particularly, but other organisations as well, in being able to see what the relevance of the SDGs to them is in times of crisis. When this was put together, we weren't in the middle of a crisis of this nature. And I think that context is really important. And I think that will probably go some way to seeing more people pick them up. The other component would be that I think many companies see this framework as being a framework for developing countries. A lot of the lists in here, they think, well, this is UNDP type activity. Now, what we would say, of course, is, well, that's not at all the case. When this was put together, we clearly decided that there wouldn't be a framework for developing countries and a framework for developed countries. The two were coming together. That is not well understood. Some look at it and say, poverty is not relevant to us. Well, of course, we would argue in a New Zealand context, it certainly is relevant, but it needs to be interpreted in a different way. So I think, again, it's about making it relevant. I really applaud this report. I think it's a very important report. Certainly gives us here at SBC some more material to work on, and we can see where we need to target some of our attention. Thanks, Rod.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed, Mike, and raising some really important questions at the end, which indeed I hope to come back to. Now we're going to turn to three separate companies to hear about their experiences with SDGs. So it's my great pleasure to call on first Mark Trojan, who's Chief Executive of Freightways, a logistics and transport company. And Mark's been with the company since 1996 and progressed through many roles in that, ending up as Chief Executive appointed in 2018. So Mark, over to you, please.
Thanks, Rod, and good afternoon, everyone. I think for us, if I give you a brief explanation of how we got to where we got to with SDGs, that might be useful. So Freightways is a business that's people heavy. We have 5,000 people across New Zealand and Australia that earn their income and feed their families off what they can get from Freightways. We're made up of 12 separate companies. So we have a range of companies primarily in courier freight and information management, but more latterly in waste transformation, which I'll talk a bit more about later. The SDGs for us were a journey that we started on around 3 years ago, and it was very much leadership team led. I echo Mike's comments. We don't have a sustainability officer, manager, or any other title in the business. So we tend to take those things to heart, and we take them in through the business owners that we have in each of those companies. And it was something that resonated with us because it was really easy to understand. It was incredibly easy to start translating into the things that we need to do through our business. The journey for us started with our team. So we put together groups of teams across those businesses, different levels of the organisation, and looked for the things where we felt we could move the dial and where the SDG really resonated for our business. Then we went to shareholders and asked them the same questions. How can we really make an impact, and which of these are the most important to you? We went to our customers, went to our suppliers. So went through a range of the really critical stakeholders in our business to help figure out the materiality and which of these could we really move the dial on. As a result, there were 5. They are interrelated, I think, in a lot of ways. So good health and well-being was critical for us. You look at a big team dispersed across New Zealand and Australia, working 24/7, involved in an incredible amount of movements. We shift 100 million items a year. Every one of those we handle 5 times. That's 500 million movements that we have in any particular year. That team is incredibly important to us. So ensuring their good health and well-being and looking at a whole range of initiatives really is part of our DNA to the core. And so that one resonated, and we found it easy to really embrace it in times of crisis, but even before COVID. That links really well for us with SDG 8, which is around decent work and economic growth. And again, I think every business is focused on growth. That growth for us is shared with a big part of our team. So a large number of our team are shareholders in the business. The contractors we have share in the revenue of the business. And I think what we're most proud of as we've come through COVID is we're probably one of the few organisations where we have a group of contractors, they're all earning 10% more than they did pre-COVID. And there wouldn't be too many businesses you would find where you've managed to deliver that economic growth and rate increase through your business. SDG 9, again, really core to Freightways. Freightways thinks in 3 horizons of growth. So examples of that, we're involved in a document destruction business. Paper inevitably will have a decline. People won't use as much of it in the future as they do now, although people have forecast that for about 30 odd years. But we think of that as the first horizon. The second horizon for growth has been in picking up and processing medical waste, which was an absolute godsend, I think, for the people of Victoria in particular through the crisis. But off the back of that infrastructure and off the back of those people, and to make sure that the people who are involved in document destruction and our teams have a job in the future, we focus on a third horizon of growth. And for us, that is around recycling. And so what we're involved in today is high value recycling, looking at opportunities to pick up and process items that would otherwise go into landfill and turn them into real products. So for us, we've invested in a business that will turn Tetra Pak containers, after they've been collected, shredded, baled, we'll process it and turn it into ceiling tiles and wallboard and what have you. So if I just use those few examples, I think we've made the SDGs incredibly real for our business. Our teams have strategic plans where they talk about the initiatives they have within those SDGs. And the effort we give to them is pretty significant through application of capital and through the strategies that we adopt. It's been a really comfortable, happy fit, I think, for our business. Something that's easy to reference, pretty easy to talk about, although I do accept that there'll be more and more demands on listed companies to report on all manner of things, good and bad, to your point, Kylie. But we've found it easy to start telling the stories and talking about the numbers and the progress that we're making in those particular areas. So look, for us, it's been good, it's been easy, and I think it's been really well accepted through our business.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. And I'm very keen to come back and pick up on some particular points in there from you. For our second company view, I'm now going to turn to Lachlan Feggans, who's Director of Sustainability Asia Pacific for Brambles, another transport and logistics company. And Lachlan has been very involved in initiating the integrated reporting journey for Brambles. So it's a very good example of SDGs being used in that framework. So over to you, Lachlan. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod, and thank you, Kylie, for the acknowledgement to country, and thank you to the ThinkStep team for the report. It's been really interesting reading. Look, the story of sustainability at Brambles goes back right to the beginning, and I'm not going to go back there, but where I will go back to is where we started interacting with the SDGs, which was really when they came out in 2016, January, in fact. The timing was perfect. I joined Brambles late 2015. We just developed a sustainability strategy. Bringing those SDGs to the strategy actually allowed us to amplify our sustainability message much more effectively than we would have otherwise done. And I think that was really fantastic. And we actually did a lot of work with the GCNA with Kylie's former role, Alice, who was the executive director of the GCNA. And what we saw was this industry body, essentially the GCNA, grabbing onto the SDGs and trying to promote them. And we absolutely jumped on that bandwagon and used that platform to talk about our business and why it's inherently sustainable. So similar to what Mark's done in terms of identifying the most relevant SDGs to the business, that the number one that we would pick would be SDG 12, which is responsible production and consumption. We interpret that as a circular economy, something that has been talked about for a very long time, but as we all know, is actually really challenging to implement in a lot of different economies. So for those of you on the call, Brambles, we are a supply chain logistics organisation, but we're probably better known through our operating brand, which is CHEP Pallets. So we essentially provide reusable packaging platforms or reusable platforms for manufacturers to move their goods through the supply chain, and producers, for example. So no doubt, Mark, with fair few pallets running on your vehicles in New Zealand over the years. So the whole premise behind our sustainability story and why SDG 12 means so much for our business is that we operate what's called a share and reuse business model, a circular business model, where our reuse is absolutely at the core of our business. So we're reusing these pallets, crates, or containers over and over and over again. And every time one of those is used, we eliminate the requirement for a single-use alternative. And that's where the sustainability benefit of Brambles' business model comes into play. And we measure that benefit too. We use a lot of life cycle assessment. And this is something that the ThinkStep team are absolute experts in. And we're able to transparently communicate to our stakeholders, here's the Brambles solution, here's the alternative. With Brambles, you're going to save carbon, waste, water, you name it. And clearly those environmental benefits plug directly into a whole range of different SDGs that might resonate with either customers or investors and definitely with our employees. So yeah, SDG 12 is really at the core of our business, and we really want to see that one expand. And I think that, like we're seeing with climate at the moment, in embracing the circular economy is accelerating, every week, which is really good to hear. The other fundamental SDG, which we would call out, is SDG 15. And Tim, you would have seen that it probably didn't rate very highly on being chosen by a lot of organisations within Australia or New Zealand. But sustainable forestry is absolutely critical to Brambles' business model. Last year, we achieved 100% sustainable sourcing right around the globe, which is fantastic. But what it also did is it transformed a lot of the forestry markets around the globe that weren't doing sustainable forestry previously. So that was quite a transformational objective that the business put in place, and has actually helped those markets across the world become more sustainable. And I think that's fantastic. So SDG 15 is really fundamental to our business. And I do have an example where we've engaged our employees on the SDGs, but I might leave that for later in the discussion so we can progress with and hear from Matt, because I know Matt's got a brilliant SDG story as well. So thank you, Rod.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed, Lachlan. And now it's my great pleasure to turn to our fifth and final panelist, Matthew Brennan, who's head of sustainability strategy at Transurban. Matt has over 25 years experience with public and private sector infrastructure and real estate businesses, and heads up, as I say, Transurban's sustainability practice that the company manages and develops urban toll roads in Australia and North America. So some fascinating sustainability challenges there. Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rod, and thank you very much, ThinkStep, for your report and organising this panel. It's fantastic to be involved. So Transurban's had a long-standing commitment to sustainability, and I joined the company in around about mid-2015. And as we were starting to discuss the approaches to sustainability across the organisation, it became clear that there was no sort of like coordinating or organising framework around what sustainability actually meant for the organisation. So, ensuring when the SDGs actually became introduced as a framework, we jumped on it pretty quickly, because we thought, here is something that the global community has come together around and actually articulated about the way forward to address pressing global social, economic, and environmental challenges. So I thought, well, that's a really good place for us to have a deep look around what sustainability means for us as an organisation, and stop sometimes what I think is the unnecessary discussions that go on at the beginning of setting sustainability strategy around what does sustainability mean for the organisation. So by using that as the foundation for our sustainability strategy, we were able to short circuit a number of those discussions. And really importantly, we have found that employees within the business have very quickly latched on to this concept of, hey, I can actually make a real difference here through the work that I do in the organization towards addressing these pressing global challenges. So it's a very powerful framework and concept that has been, I think, very useful for us in terms of our journey. So in 2017, we had a very close look at the goals, and we worked out that there were 9 material goals for us. And we started to do, in the early stages, quite preliminary reporting, but we wanted to actually start the discipline of actually talking about the goals and what we'd actually done initially in relation to those goals before evolving that framework, and then doing a much deeper look at the range of indicators and targets that were specifically applicable to our business. either fully applicable or partly applicable, and then look at the gaps in the programs that we had in place around the organisation. So that's been a very useful process for us. As a result of that, we identified, and this was one of the things that I wanted to sort of share with people, that it can seem a little daunting when you look at the full set of indicators and targets, but don't let it put you off, because there are some real gems in there that you'll find very quickly are applicable to your business. And it will, I think, also encourage some great collaboration within an organization to fine-tune specific approaches and opportunities. So we found that very beneficial. So we found that when we looked at the 169 official targets, that 27 of those were specifically applicable to the organization. But indeed, a further 29 targets are appropriate for us to pursue that link up to the broad aspiration expressed with a particular goal. And with the 232 indicators, we found that there were only 19, but 19 very important indicators that were applicable to us. So that was a very important learning for us. So we're now using the SDGs as the basis for our strategy, our sustainability strategy and our sustainability policy. And we're already starting to see some terrific results with some of the specific indicators and targets that we've picked up. So just wanted to call out one in particular. So target 9.1 relates to developing quality, reliable and sustainable infrastructure, among other things. And that, of course, is absolutely core business for us. So as at the end of FY20, we had delivered in excess of $13.7 billion worth of projects. And by having a policy position which has been informed by the SDGs around requiring sustainability ratings for those infrastructure projects, and that's not only for Australia but also for North America, we've been able to work with the contractors to help avoid 400,000 tonnes of carbon emissions through redesigning designs and appropriately selecting materials with lower carbon content. We've been able to avoid the use of 300,000 tonnes of concrete to roughly 200,000 tonnes of aggregate and roughly 200,000 tonnes worth of asphalt. So that is, I think, a good example of just the power of an individual target and thinking deeply around what that might mean for your organization, and then putting the right policy and procedure settings in place to actually integrate that into the way that you do business. So we found it very useful indeed as an organizing framework and a motivation for change within the organization. The other thing that I wanted to call out is around the power of the SDGs in relation to your supply chain. So I don't know whether many have heard of a global organization called supportthegoals.org. I'm sure you have, Kylie. But we've not long ago become a corporate member of that organization. And what they do, their mission is to increase the understanding, the awareness, the understanding, and then the take-up of the SDGs globally. And they have a target of doing that for 1 million businesses by 2030. So as part of our engagement with them, we've started to actually look at how our supply chain is looking at the SDGs. And looking at 135 suppliers to date, we found that none of them, so they do a star rating from 0 to 5. 0 means basically, no acknowledgement whatsoever of the SDGs, through to 5, which is starting to work with their suppliers around the SDGs. So we found that 24% of those 135 suppliers are actually doing something in relation to the SDGs. Indeed, some of them are doing great things, and they've identified specific targets, and they're actually making progress and reporting on those. On the other hand, however, the balance, roughly 76% aren't doing anything at all. So it is still pretty early days in terms of, deep consideration of SDGs within supply chains. And that's where we believe that that corporates who do have the resources, who do have a sustainability professional or two in their teams have a role to play in terms of helping to transform consideration of the SDGs within the broader supply chain network.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed, Matt. And I'm very glad you raised that question about reaching out into the supply chains to really leverage the process here. Let me just, for starters on questions, just ask all of you whether there was something particularly about this ThinkStep report which was a bit of a surprise in terms of a data point or a trend there that you think delivered some real insight as to how the take-up of SDGs is going. And as I say, any takers from amongst the five of you on that overarching question?
There wasn't anything overly surprising, but I think similar to ThinkStep, I've spent a lot of time, with UN Global Compact reports where they've done similar analysis. So I think, if anything, it was good to see the consistency. Worldwide, it really cements that there's a lot more work to be done, and the scale and reach that we actually have to achieve collectively to be able to deliver on the SDGs.
One of the things that I found that was consistent with my understanding as well was that SDGs was just one framework that was used amongst a whole range of other ones as well. And Mark's mentioned that there's a plethora of frameworks that sustainability people can get buried under. But I think one of the most important things that we have done, and we do on a reasonably regular basis, is looking at what's important for Brambles. And that's the materiality assessment. And we did that with a lot of focus just last year, and we updated that after 2 years, and that, of course, that had changed as well from the 5 years previous to that when we looked at that. And I think that plugging the linkages to the SDGs actually just became stronger with that materiality assessment. And I think that if an organisation is wondering where to start, be they small organisations, micro organisations, or the like, looking at what's important for their sector, their industry, is a really good starting point. And there's a huge amount of resources online to actually to draw upon to do that really efficiently, if you don't have the sustainability manager or that resource within your business as well. So that's the starting point, and you're going to find that you link to the SDGs very, very quickly through that materiality assessment.
One of the things I think that when I first saw the SDGs many years ago and saw number 3 around good health and well-being, well-being as a concept at that stage was pretty, very much in its infancy. And certainly it's the term of 2020, 2021, isn't it, really? It's all about well-being. And I think one of the reasons you've probably seen some companies beginning to lean on SDGs is that they've realized it's taken a holistic approach to sustainability, which includes some really relevant metrics for a business operating in a COVID crisis. And so I'm really pleased to see that number 3, good health and well-being, has come up the list. I imagine that will become even stronger, and certainly the conversations we've had with our members over the last 12 months suggest that is becoming the issue for their business, is how to maintain well-being of their employees and also of their customers and clients during what is turning out to be a very, very long crisis indeed. It's not the short, sharp crisis that people thought it would be initially. This is looking more like a war. And it's going to run over a number of years. And just like a war, people are going to get worn out and tired. And so there's a lot in these SDGs, I think, that businesses can learn from and draw from, because some of it is things that haven't been core business to business for a long time, and yet has been core business in other areas. Certainly the work that the UN's been doing for many years now. So I think there's some lessons in there.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that with a really practical example. I think Mike's dead right. When you went through COVID, stresses, mental health issues, the strains, the uncertainty for people was really critical. So a key one for us under that particular SDG was to get out and train anybody who managed anyone. So that was any team leader, supervisor, manager, all the way up through senior management in mental health awareness. And really key focus, it was driven by the team that we have that are focused on the wellbeing part of that initiative. And you could see the impact it had. You could see, the relief on people's face when they realised, right, there was someone they could turn to. They knew that management took it seriously. They could tap into free 0800 numbers or talk to managers and know that they were going to get a sympathetic ear from that. So I think you're dead right, Mike. That well-being piece for us was important from the get-go, but I think through the last year we've seen just how important it has been.
Thank you. Let me turn now to some terrific questions from our participants today. Christine, for example, asks about what the panel thinks about where the board's responsibility lies in a company regarding greenwashing risk in sustainability and in annual reporting, and more importantly in their strategy governance. So it's really a question about that governance role in ensuring the integrity and authenticity of this work.
I'll jump in, Rod, for a quick view on that. So it's something that the board needs to be the final arbiter of content that's being released publicly around sustainability strategy and the SDGs and so on. But obviously it needs to rely on management to make sure that this is a principle which is being followed ruthlessly throughout the whole of the organization. So I think it's there as a final check and setting the marching orders and the expectations in the beginning around the approach that it would like to see in terms of reporting for an organization. But I think that I would argue that most large corporates in Australia are very much across this. And I think it's probably more of a trap for mid-cap and small-cap companies.
Yeah, I'd agree entirely with what Matt's just said. I think that what we're seeing is that the corporate sector are seeing sustainability and therefore things like SDGs as core business now. It's just the same as health and safety was 15 years ago. And in New Zealand, of course, we've had some legal advice on the fiduciary duty of boards in respect of reporting on things like climate, and there is a duty there. And with the introduction of compulsory, TCFD reporting for the top 300 companies in New Zealand, this is now becoming core business. So I think, in a way, that will build up momentum, and it won't take care of itself. But I think we'll see that maturing. I think the challenge for New Zealand and Australia, and in fact many countries, is that medium-sized and small sector, where this is yet another quite onerous area of reporting that's really critical to their business, but that they will often see that is difficult to get to. And that's where we're seeing the role of the corporate sector is in looking down through its supply chains and value chains and working out how it can support maybe smaller companies that are part of that broader business and assisting them in that journey. And I think there's a real leadership role there for bigger companies in New Zealand and Australia in showing smaller companies and how to get there.
Just want to jump in again and circle back on something that you shared with us earlier, Kylie. I totally agree with what you were saying around a transparent approach to reporting and being prepared to share the challenges as well as the successes. And I think that actually goes to the point as well around greenwashing and telling things how they actually are, so that your stakeholders can have confidence in you.
So, Rod, just one last thing on the greenwashing thing, and this is something that SBC's done for a long time. I think holding businesses to account on this is really critical. We have a series of commitments that our members have to make if they're going to be members. And that includes, showing annual reports on progress, very transparent reporting, a whole range of things. And we exit people if they don't actually meet those commitments. And they're not very nice conversations, but they're important conversations. And very often what we see is once you have that conversation, that company very often circles back and joins a year, 2 years down the line once they've got their reporting in line. So I would really encourage companies to, again, show that leadership by belonging to organizations like ours and others that do provide that kind of check to ensure that actually you can't greenwash because the information has to be published and can be critically checked.
Fine, thank you. Now, there's, in a sense, an allied question now from one of our participants about there's various frameworks that one could use. They are just essentially locking into problems in some slightly different ways, but lead to those common goals of sustainability in various forms. So what is it particularly about SDGs which you believe gives you an edge over some of those other frameworks?
I don't know if it necessarily means giving it an edge. We said at the start that the SDGs provide that really clear framework, like it's 17 goals, it's distilled into targets and indicators. But there are things that are going to be there to support those mechanisms, right? So, for example, with climate action, at the Global Compact, we really advocate for companies to set a science-based target that aligns with Paris, right? So this is a science-based target that is at least at 1.5 degrees, preferably far less than. And that then directly contributes to Sustainable Development Goal 13. There are lots and lots of frameworks out there too that are reporting focused. So that they would over time require a company to shift their thinking. But the SDGs actually really forces almost companies to consider, well, how are we going to do this strategically? And it elevates those discussions. And I'm sure that Matt, Mark and Lachlan can talk to this in more detail as well. But our sense from talking to our members is that the SDGs help elevate the conversation around the contributions to sustainable development up the chain within businesses, right? Like BCSD, or the World Business Commission for Sustainable Development, estimated that the SDGs drive about US 12 trillion worth of opportunities across a range of sectors. So the opportunity to scale and invest in those broad SDGs is really, really broad. And they're the types, really big, and they're the types of opportunities that boards and executive management like to hear, because it directly ties with their budget. But it doesn't mean that there aren't challenges, right? Like, we can get into a situation of over-reporting, and, you know, to Mike's point, there are a lot of companies out there that are small to medium. Lachlan and Matt said it as well, that those smaller companies are the ones that are struggling, and they won't have the capacity, time, resources to actually do a really strong report on all of the things that large companies are reporting on. But the SDGs offer them a framework to understand which goals and which sustainable development areas they're actually being able to pull a positive lever on.
Thank you. And in terms of experience within your companies, about the level of engagement and enthusiasm and interest that the SDGs and the way you're applying them speaks to people in the company, what sort of buy-in are you getting, and how does this change the way that people engage in their work?
Just very quickly, and again, it's not so much an SDG focus here, and I think it's based on the many frameworks that businesses need to report against. But I think the one framework that's had probably a lot of impact, definitely within Australia, and clearly, as Mike said, it's now legislated in New Zealand, is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We were on an integrated reporting pathway, and we still are. That's a journey. But TCFD really came in 2020 and essentially sort of took over that process. And that was really unique in that it forced a business to really engage in a lot of depth in all the different regions in which we operate. And we're in 60 countries, most of the business in the Northern Hemisphere, to understand the financial risks of climate change outside your business as well as within it. And that had a huge amount of impact in our business, right up to the board level, in terms of how we govern the business, how we make decisions, and we're still working through that progress now, and we'll report on that in August again this year. But I think that that particular framework is, many will probably agree, is probably having the most cut through with the executive and the board level within an organisation, in terms of there's risk. There's risk in climate risk, change, absolutely. But what I think really grabbed the attention within Brambles is look at the opportunity of the low carbon economy. And it helped us tell a story about our sustainable low carbon business model that was ready for that and ready to capitalise. And I think that positive framing of the TCFD, which was really brought out as a risk framework, helped change the engagement of senior management and the board within the sustainability issues, especially climate action.
Yeah, I think, Rod, we frame those SDGs as sort of aspirational and very positive. areas. So SDG 13 clearly for us as a transport operator, planes, trucks, vans, that's critical, and that's reporting on one of the things we do where we're not that good for the environment. But our people really look at that quite aspirationally, and so when we go out and implement some of the things that we've been doing with customers around pricing, looking at how we can make our contractors better off, and we own our Scope 3 emissions as if they were Scope 1. So that we can get to a point that we can reduce those over time by shifting to the technology as it arrives. Our team look at that really aspirationally and very positively. So I think we've used it as a positive thing, as opposed to, some of these other mechanisms that might audit you and I don't know, seem a little bit more draconian in the emphasis they have around them. For us, I think the SDG framework is quite an aspirational one.
By way of wrapping up, I'll just turn now back to you, Barbara and Tim, on some of the things that have come through for you in this discussion this afternoon.
Thanks so much to all of our panelists for sharing their SDG journey with us. I thought it was very cool to see how the SDGs are implemented at all levels of an organization. So Mark talked a lot about how employees engage with the SDGs, and Matthew highlighted the importance of the board signing off on the SDGs and in the reporting. So it really is something that is implemented across the whole organization. And going beyond even just your organizations, I think the other level of breadth that was commented on was small companies want to do them, find it possibly a bit hard. So they need to rely on you guys, the larger companies, also for some support, which really brings us to SDG 17, which is collaboration for the goals, which actually is my favorite goal.
A final comment from my experience this afternoon. As a business journalist, I am delighted to hear how your organizations as companies, or your overarching organizations, for Mike and Kylie, are using SDGs, because it sort of integrates business so much more fully in society in a way that I think some other sustainability frameworks might not do. And again, it's giving us a framework, something of a common language to be able to work on these fiendishly complicated issues, but in solving them, ones that can deliver multiple benefits for our companies, for our societies, and ultimately for the planet itself. So thank you, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you all on this. So thank you, and so we'll back to you, Barbara and Tim, just to send us on our way.
Thanks again to all our panelists and to Rod for taking us through the discussions this afternoon. For those of you who haven't yet downloaded our report and want to dig into the results that Tim shared in a bit more detail, our report is available on our website. I'll just show it up here again, and it's free for all of you to download. If you have further feedback on the report, please send it through. We'd be thrilled to hear what we can include in further updates. Thanks everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.